Most ghost stories are often shared as legends, passed down long after the people involved have disappeared. However, something quite intriguing was happening in Britain during the 18th and 19th centuries. Back then, reports of strange ghostly encounters occasionally made their way into newspapers, presented as just another piece of everyday news. Witnesses described figures walking through parks late at night, phantom carriages racing across empty roads, voices answering questions from inside the walls of houses, and silent apparitions appearing in bedrooms and railway tunnels. These weren't just entertaining tales, they were real-life stories shared in local newspapers. People read them believing they were true accounts of actual events. Tonight we're looking at 10 of the weirdest ghost stories ever reported in old newspapers. Strange encounters that left witnesses confused, frightened, and sometimes unable to explain what they had just seen. So let's get started. In the winter of 1762, a small house on a narrow street known as Cock Lane in the City of London became the centre of one of the strangest stories ever reported in the British press. The street itself was typical of 18th century London, lined with closely packed houses where families lived only a few feet apart, and where every unusual noise carried easily through the thin walls. Inside one of these houses lived a young girl whose bedroom would soon attract visitors from across the city, as rumours began spreading that something strange was happening in the room at night. The disturbances reportedly began with knocking sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls and beneath the bed where the girl slept. At first, the family believed it might be loose wood or pipes shifting within the old building, which would be a logical explanation. However, the sounds soon began occurring in response to questions asked aloud in the room. When visitors gathered around the bed and asked the unseen presence simple questions, the knocking appeared to answer with a pattern of taps that witnesses claimed could spell out words or confirm yes and no responses. As you can well imagine, news of the strange events spread quickly through London, and before long, the small bedroom was crowded with curious visitors eager to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Some described hearing the knocks clearly from beneath the floorboards, while others claimed the sounds seemed to come directly from the bed itself. When you think about this, it all sort of makes sense. A lot of people in a small room. No clear view, they are going to experience differences. Would you agree? As the crowds grew larger, the supposed spirit began answering more complicated questions, which is interesting. But then witnesses claimed the knocking revealed the identity of the ghost as a woman who had died under suspicious circumstances and who now wished to expose the man responsible for her death. Whether people believed the story or not, the events in the house quickly became the subject of intense curiosity throughout the city. Newspapers began reporting on the strange happenings. Investigators eventually examined the room. They questioned the witnesses, and the case was widely exposed as a hoax, involving tricks used to imitate the knocking sounds. Even so, many people who had stood in the crowded bedroom insisted they had heard something they could not explain, and the strange story remained one of the earliest ghost cases ever widely reported in the British press. So what do you think? It certainly is a weird ghost story. Not only that, but one of those stories that is interesting, and you either believe it or not. But the strange knocking inside that London bedroom was only the beginning, because a few decades later, another ghost story caused an entire neighbourhood to panic. In the winter of 1803, the quiet village of Hammersmith on the western edge of London became the centre of a strange and unsettling rumour. At the time, Hammersmith was not yet part of the sprawling city it would later become. It was a small riverside community of narrow lanes, scattered houses, and open fields, where travellers often walked home after dark along poorly lit roads. During the colder months, thick fog from the nearby River Thames frequently drifted through the streets, turning the area into a place of deep shadows and uncertain shapes once the lanterns were extinguished for the night. It was in these fog-filled streets that residents began reporting sightings of something they could not easily explain. Witnesses claimed they had seen a tall white figure wandering along the lanes late at night, sometimes near the churchyard, and sometimes moving slowly along the road before disappearing into the darkness. The figure appeared to glow faintly in the mist, and several people insisted it looked like a person wrapped in a white burial shroud. Which sounds a bit creepy, and of course strangely weird. As you would expect, rumours spread quickly throughout the village, and the sightings soon became the subject of conversation in homes and taverns across the area. Some residents believed the apparition was the restless spirit of a man who had taken his own life and been buried nearby. Others insisted the figure must be a trick played by someone attempting to frighten travellers. Whatever the explanation, the fear grew strong enough that several locals began patrolling the streets at night, determined to confront whatever had been seen wandering through the fog. One of these patrols ended in tragedy. Late one evening, a frightened watchman named Francis Smith encountered a figure dressed in white moving along the road. Believing he had finally found the ghost that had terrified the neighbourhood for weeks, Smith raised his gun and fired. The figure collapsed immediately, but when the lantern light revealed the victim's face, it became clear that the supposed ghost was an innocent bricklayer named Thomas Millwood, who had simply been wearing white work clothes as he walked home. The shocking incident quickly became known as the Hammersmith Ghost murder case, attracting attention far beyond the small community. Newspapers across London reported the strange events that had led to the shooting, describing how fear of a wandering ghost had caused an entire neighbourhood to panic. The court case that followed raised difficult questions about responsibility and belief. And although the supposed ghost was never proven to exist, the story of the Hammersmith apparition remained one of the most unusual ghost cases ever connected to a real criminal trial. While the Hammersmith Ghost terrified the streets of London, the next story is stranger in a very different way, because witnesses claimed they saw an entire funeral procession travelling silently through the countryside. In the late 19th century, several quiet villages scattered across the countryside of Somerset were connected by narrow country roads that wound between fields, hedgerows, and small stone cottages. These roads were often poorly lit. Once night fell, the countryside could become extremely dark and silent, broken only by the distant sound of wind moving through the trees or the occasional passing carriage. It was along one of these lonely roads, not far from a village churchyard, that witnesses would later report seeing something so unusual that it quickly became the subject of local newspaper reports. One evening, as dusk settled across the fields and a light fog began drifting over the road, several travellers claimed they saw a horse-drawn hearse slowly approaching from the distance. At first, the sight seemed ordinary enough, as funeral processions were a familiar part of village life during that time. The black carriage moved steadily forward, pulled by dark horses, while several other carriages followed quietly behind it. But as the procession drew closer, the witnesses began to notice something unsettling about the scene. The road was silent. The usual sounds of horses' hooves and turning wheels could not be heard, even though the carriages appeared to be moving along the gravel road. The figures inside the carriages also remained strangely still, their faces difficult to see through the dim evening light and the drifting fog. The procession continued slowly toward the churchyard at the edge of the village, disappearing briefly behind a bend in the road. Curious and uneasy, the witnesses walked after it, expecting to find the funeral party gathering near the church gates. Instead, when they reached the bend only moments later, the road ahead was completely empty. The hearse, the horses, and the silent carriages had all vanished without leaving any trace. Reports of the strange encounter soon appeared in local newspapers, describing how several witnesses had seen what they believed to be a full funeral procession travelling along the road before disappearing entirely. Stories like these were sometimes known as phantom funerals, a type of apparition occasionally reported in rural parts of Britain. Whether the witnesses had mistaken shadows in the fog or experienced something far stranger, the mysterious funeral procession remained one of the more unusual ghostly sightings recorded in the countryside of Somerset. But the next report in the newspapers described something even stranger, a trail of mysterious footprints stretching across miles of countryside. In February of 1855, a heavy snowfall covered the county of Devon overnight. When people stepped outside the following morning, they expected to see the usual signs of animal movement from throughout the night. Instead, many of them stopped in confusion as they noticed a single trail of strange footprints stretching across the snow that seemed to travel straight through villages and fields, as though whatever had made them had walked across the countryside without ever stopping. A long trail of unusual footprints could be seen stretching across fields, gardens, rooftops, and frozen streams. The marks appeared to resemble small hoof prints, similar to those left by a donkey or horse, yet they followed a single line that continued for miles without stopping. Farmers and villagers began tracing the tracks as they moved across the countryside. The strange footprints crossed over walls and fences, passed directly across frozen rivers, and even appeared on the roofs of houses and barns, where no animal could easily reach. In some places, the tracks seemed to continue across narrow openings and obstacles, without breaking the steady line of the prints. What made the sight even more unsettling was that the footprints appeared to travel in an unbroken line across the landscape, as though whatever had made them had simply walked forward without hesitation for miles. Witnesses claimed the tracks stretched across dozens of villages, before eventually fading into the snow-covered hills. Reports of the strange tracks soon appeared in newspapers across southern England, where they quickly became known as the Devil's Footprints. Some residents believed the marks must have been left by an unknown animal wandering through the night, while others suggested that unusual weather conditions might have altered the shape of ordinary tracks. But the unusual path of the prints and the distance they appeared to cover made the mystery difficult to explain. Even today, the strange trail discovered across the snow in Devon during the winter of 1855 remains one of the most unusual, unexplained events ever reported in British newspapers. The mystery of the Devil's Footprints was never solved, but the next strange report came from somewhere far darker, a railway tunnel where workers claimed they encountered something they could not explain. By the middle of the 19th century, railways were spreading quickly across Britain. New lines were being cut through hills and countryside, and workers spent long days digging tunnels through solid rock so the tracks could pass beneath the landscape. These tunnels were often narrow, damp, and poorly lit places where only the glow of a lantern broke the darkness. It was in one such tunnel, reported in a local newspaper, that railway workers claimed to have encountered something they could not explain. One evening, a small group of railway workers entered the tunnel to carry out routine maintenance along the track. The men were used to working in difficult conditions, and the long stretch of darkness inside the tunnel was something they had experienced many times before. As they walked deeper inside, one of the men noticed a figure standing further along the track. At first, he assumed it must be another worker who had entered the tunnel ahead of them. The shape appeared to be standing perfectly still, partly hidden by the darkness beyond the reach of their lanterns. When the men called out, the figure did not move or answer. Thinking something might be wrong, they continued walking toward it. But as their lantern light reached the place where the figure had been standing, the workers realized the track ahead of them was completely empty. Some of the men later insisted they had clearly seen the outline of a person standing in the tunnel only moments before. Yet there were no side passages where anyone could have stepped aside, and the only way out of the tunnel was the direction the men had just come from. Stories of strange sightings along railway lines were not uncommon during the early years of rail travel, and newspapers occasionally printed reports from workers who believed they had seen something unusual while working at night. Whether the railway workers had mistaken shadows in the lantern light or encountered something stranger, the brief report of the figure seen standing inside the tunnel remained one of the more unsettling stories connected to Britain's early railway lines. Before we move on to the next story, If you're enjoying these strange ghost accounts reported in old newspapers, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Now back to your video. The next report came from a house in Bath, where people claimed they kept seeing the same silent woman. In the early 19th century, the city of Bath was known for its elegant Georgian houses, wide streets, and quiet residential squares. Many of these tall stone buildings were divided into rented rooms where travellers and visitors could stay while exploring the famous spa city. One such house, mentioned in a brief newspaper report at the time, began to attract attention after several people claimed they had seen the same strange figure inside the building. According to the report, the sightings usually happened late in the evening when the house had grown quiet and most of the occupants had retired to their rooms. On several occasions, visitors walking along the hallway claimed they saw a woman standing near the staircase. She appeared to be dressed in dark clothing and remained completely still, as though waiting for someone. At first, those who saw the figure assumed she must have been another guest staying in the house, but when they spoke to her, the woman did not answer. Instead, she remained where she was, silent and unmoving in the dim candlelight of the hallway. Witnesses said that when they stepped closer, the figure slowly faded from sight until the hallway was empty again. Several people later insisted they had seen the same woman on different evenings, always standing near the staircase and never speaking. The repeated sightings began to unsettle some of the residents of the house. A few people avoided the staircase late at night, while others claimed they heard quiet footsteps in the hallway even when no one else appeared to be awake. Stories of the mysterious figure eventually appeared in local newspapers, where the house gained a reputation for being haunted by what people began calling the Silent Woman of Bath. Some believed the apparition might have been connected to a former resident of the building, while others suggested the sightings were simply the result of shadows and candlelight playing tricks on tired eyes. Whatever the explanation, the strange reports from the house became one of the more unusual ghost stories associated with the historic city of Bath. The next report printed in the newspapers came from a very different setting, the busy docks of Bristol, where workers claimed they saw something walking along the harbour late at night. During the 19th century, the docks of Bristol were among the busiest in Britain. Ships from across the world arrived in the harbour carrying cargo, and the waterfront was filled with warehouses and narrow streets leading down to the water. Dock workers often worked long hours loading and unloading ships, and many remained at the harbour late into the night when the busy daytime activity had finally begun to settle. It was during those quiet hours, according to a brief report printed in a local newspaper, that several workers claimed they had seen something strange walking along the edge of the docks. One evening, a dock worker was making his way along the harbour after finishing work when he noticed a lone figure standing beside the water. The man appeared to be dressed like a sailor, wearing clothing similar to that worn by seamen working on the ships in the harbour. At first, nothing about the sight seemed unusual. Sailors were often seen moving between ships and nearby streets late at night. But the worker soon noticed something that made him pause. The man standing by the water did not appear to move at all. He simply stood there looking out across the dark harbour. When the worker walked closer, the man suddenly vanished. The dockside was empty, and the water beside the harbour wall moved quietly against the stone as though no one had been there at all. Reports of the strange sightings eventually appeared in local newspapers, where some readers suggested the figure might represent the ghost of a sailor who had lost his life in the busy harbour. Others believed the sightings were nothing more than shadows and reflections moving across the water at night. Whatever the explanation, the quiet docks of Bristol gained yet another strange story connected to the long maritime history of the harbour. But the next strange report printed in the newspapers came from a house in York, where neighbours claimed they kept hearing unexplained screams late at night. In the 19th century, the ancient city of York was known for its narrow streets, timber-framed buildings, and rows of tightly packed houses that had stood for centuries. Many of these buildings were already old by Victorian times, and some had been divided into small rented rooms where families or travellers could stay. One such house, mentioned in a short newspaper report, became the subject of local attention after neighbours began claiming they were hearing something strange coming from inside the building late at night. According to the report, the first complaints began when residents living nearby started hearing loud cries coming from the house after midnight. The sounds were described as sudden screams that echoed through the quiet street. At first, the neighbours believed someone inside the house must have been in trouble. On more than one occasion, people stepped outside to listen more carefully, expecting to see someone leaving the building or calling for help, but the street remained completely empty. Those living closest to the house insisted the cries sounded like a woman screaming somewhere inside the building. Yet, when people approached the door or knocked to check if anyone needed assistance, there was no answer from within. Eventually, curiosity and concern led a small group of neighbours to enter the building to investigate. But when they searched the rooms, weirdly enough, they found the house completely empty. The strange events were briefly mentioned in a local newspaper, where the building soon gained the nickname the Screaming House. Some readers believed the sounds must have been caused by ordinary disturbances within the old building, while others suggested the cries might have been something far more darker and evil. Whatever the explanation, the report left behind one of the more unsettling stories connected to the historic streets of York. While that abandoned house left witnesses searching for answers, travellers crossing the open heath outside London began reporting a sight that sounded almost impossible. In the 19th century, the open heathland of Blackheath lay on the edge of London, where wide grassy fields stretched beside the main road leading toward the city. Travellers often crossed the heath by horse and carriage, especially in the evening when the road was quieter and the journey into London was easier. Although the area was busy during the day, the open land could feel strangely empty after dark when mist rolled across the fields and the distant lights of the city were barely visible. According to several reports printed in newspapers during the 19th century, travellers crossing the heath late at night occasionally described seeing a strange coach moving along the road. Witnesses said the carriage appeared suddenly in the distance, drawn by horses that moved at a steady pace across the road. At first, nothing about the sight seemed unusual, as carriages frequently travelled between the outskirts and the centre of London. But as the coach drew closer, some travellers began to notice something unsettling. The carriage made almost no sound as it moved across the road. The usual noise of wheels on the ground and the steady rhythm of horses' hooves could not be heard. Those who reported the sighting later insisted the coach had been clearly visible in the misty lantern light before disappearing without any sign of where it had gone. Stories of phantom carriages were occasionally reported in 19th century newspapers, especially in areas where roads crossed open countryside or heathland. Some readers believed the sightings were simply travellers mistaking distant shapes in the fog, while others believed they were witnessing something far more mysterious. The strange coach reportedly seen crossing Blackheath became one of the more curious stories connected to the old road leading toward London. During the 19th century, the harbour city of Portsmouth was one of the most important naval bases in Britain. Warships regularly entered and left the harbour, and soldiers were stationed throughout the area to guard the docks and nearby fortifications. At night, sentries were posted along the harbour walls and around the defensive structures overlooking the water. One such guard post, mentioned in a brief newspaper report, later became connected to a strange event witnessed by several soldiers. One night, a sentry was standing watch along the harbour fortifications when he noticed another guard walking along the wall a short distance away. The man appeared to be wearing the uniform of a soldier and was moving slowly along the path as though carrying out a routine patrol. At first, the sentry assumed the guard must have been part of the regular patrol moving between posts. But something about the movement caught his attention. The soldier appeared to walk past the edge of the lantern without making any sound. On a second look, he noticed the soldier was actually gliding along, his feet not making contact with the ground. More curious than scared, the sentry followed along the wall toward the place where the guard had gone. But when he reached the corner, the path ahead was completely empty. There were no gates or stairways nearby, where the guard could have disappeared, and the harbour wall stretched in both directions, with no sign of anyone walking along it. The soldier later reported the incident, and other guards stationed there began to share similar accounts of a lone soldier seen patrolling the wall late at night. The strange encounter was briefly mentioned in a newspaper report at the time, where some readers suggested the soldiers might have mistaken shadows or distant figures moving in the lantern light. Others believed the figure could have been the ghost of a guard who had once served there. Whatever the explanation, the story became one of the many unusual tales connected to the long military history of Portsmouth's harbour. Those were 10 of the weirdest ghost stories ever reported in old newspapers. Each one came from a different place and a different time, yet the witnesses all described moments they could never fully explain. Whether these events were misunderstandings, strange coincidences, or something far more mysterious is something no one has ever been able to prove. I would love to hear your opinions on them. Until the next story, good night.